All right, let's dive into a fascinating political puzzle. How does some of the wealthiest monarchies in the Gulf manage to stay so politically stable even with very little public representation? Well, the secret, as it turns out, is a powerful system of patronage.
And that really brings us to the core question here. You've got these nations with just staggering amounts of wealth, but you don't see the kind of widespread public demand for democracy that you might expect. So how exactly does all that money work to keep things just the way they are?
The answer really boils down to this idea of the benefactor state. In this kind of system, the government isn't just, a governing body. It's the main provider for its citizens. It's the ultimate source of pretty much all of their economic well-being.
And that brings us to the more technical term for this whole setup, the rentier state. A rentier state is one that gets most of its cash not from its own people through taxes, but by basically renting out its natural resources, we're talking oil and gas, to the rest of the world.
And just look at this chart. I mean, it tells the whole story, doesn't it? A whopping 85% of the state's money comes from oil and gas exports. Meanwhile, direct taxes on citizens, that's a tiny, tiny 1% sliver. This financial independence from its own population is the absolute key to the entire system.
So, what does this financial model create? Well, it builds this unwritten agreement, a kind of social contract that's often called the ruling bargain. Now, it's not written down in a constitution anywhere, but it is an incredibly powerful, unspoken deal that really shapes the entire society.
And the deal, when you get right down to it, is actually pretty simple. The state guarantees a very high standard of living, cradle-to-grave social welfare. And in return, the public accepts the political authority of the ruling family without making a big fuss or demanding a major say in how the country is run.
Now, you might be wondering how a system like this even came to be. Well, it didn't just pop up overnight. It has really deep historical roots. Back in the 18th century, this unique alliance formed between a religious movement and tribal leadership, which created a super strong political and religious foundation. And then, boom, 1938, the discovery of oil provided the fuel, quite literally, to supercharge this model into what we see today.
Okay, so what does this look like day to day? You can pretty much think of it as a simple but really effective pipeline. The state sells its resources, it collects all that cash, and then it pumps that wealth directly out to its citizens. The end result? Public compliance is pretty much locked in.
And we're not talking about small perks here. The benefits are massive, and they touch every part of daily life. Things like guaranteed, well-paying government jobs, huge subsidies on fuel and utilities, world-class healthcare and education for free, giant infrastructure projects, even things like land grants and zero-interest loans to build a house. This is what that wealth part of the bargain looks like in real life.
All right, this is where things get really interesting. We're about to see the biggest political consequence of this whole setup. It basically takes a foundational principle of Western democracy and flips it completely on its head.
Think about how it works in most places, right? Citizens pay taxes, and that gives them the leverage to demand representation and hold their leaders accountable. Now flip that script completely for the rentier state. The state distributes wealth, which in turn makes citizens into dependents, not stakeholders. The main tool for demanding accountability is just gone.
It all boils down to this simple but really powerful political truth. When a government can fund itself without needing your tax money, well, it doesn't really need your consent either.
But, no system stays the same forever, and this one is definitely feeling the pressure to change. In the 21st century, it's facing all these new challenges, like volatile oil prices and growing populations, that are forcing these states to adapt.
Look, the bottom line is, the old way of doing things is getting really expensive to maintain. When oil prices take a nosedive, or the population grows faster than the oil revenues, the state just can't afford to be as generous. The bargain is under stress, and so modernization is seen as the only way to survive. So what's the game plan? We're seeing all these moves to make government more efficient, to get private businesses going, and to pour tons of money into things like tourism, tech, and logistics. But, and this is a huge but, there's a catch. The state is extremely careful to make sure it stays the #1 employer and the ultimate gatekeeper of the economy.
And that right there tells you everything you need to know about the real goal here. All this economic diversification, it isn't really about creating a vibrant, independent private sector or giving citizens more economic freedom. It's about finding new ways to make money to keep funding the patronage system. And by doing that, making sure the ruling bargain stays intact. But like any bargain, this one has a cost. A pretty significant one, actually.
While the short-term benefits are obvious, the long-term consequences for the society are huge.
I think this quote just hits the nail on the head. It perfectly captures the trade-off. Citizens get that immediate financial security, but the price they pay is long-term political stagnation, where any kind of public participation is basically frozen in time.
It's actually a pretty clever bit of political maneuvering when you think about it. If people get unhappy, they don't demand the right to vote. No, they demand a raise or a better subsidy or a government job. Any discontent gets skillfully redirected away from challenging the actual power structure and is instead framed as an economic problem for the benefactor state to solve.
So where does that leave us? With a massive critical question mark hanging over the future. This entire system, this whole bargain, is built on a foundation of oil money. As the rest of the world starts to move towards new kinds of energy, you have to ask, can a deal built on oil actually survive? And can these new modernization projects really generate enough cash to replace it? That is the billion-dollar question for the future of these nations.